Good evening. Thank you for being here tonight. As you know, Election Day was a great day that many of us will never forget. For some, it was a day where we could vote with ease, no lines at the polls, no trouble checking in, no trouble with the voting machines. But for others, it was not a pleasant experience, including standing in long lines and problems checking in at polling places. Many ran into problems before Election Day, experiencing issues such as standing in line for many hours and trouble with the voter registration process. What we like to call the greatest democracy in the world, these problems should not occur, and they should certainly not occur on large scales. Our right to vote is the very foundation of our democracy. As the Supreme Court noted in Westbury versus Saunders in 1964, no right is more precious in a free country than that of having a voice in the election of those who make the laws under which, as good citizens, we must live. Other rights, even the most basic, are illusory if the right to vote is undermined. Unfortunately, there's a trend creeping up around the country that threatens this very core of our democracy, and that is the addition of unnecessary complications in the voting process. One of these is the trend of passing laws requiring voters to show voter identification before voting. Many states require photo IDs, government-issued photo IDs, but fortunately, Virginia's voter registration and voter ID requirements are not as strict because voters can use many forms of valid ID that just has their name and address, including bank statements and other forms of ID. In addition to that, the State Board of Elections sent everyone who's registered to vote a voter registration card. That card serves as voter ID, so we do not have the problems in Virginia that people in other states had, where they actually had to go, pay for birth certificates, stand in line at DMV, take time off of work and go to DMV, pay fees in order to get a voter ID card that they could use to vote. Everybody registered to vote in Virginia had an ID sent to them, so our problems were not as severe. However, we still need to keep an eye on trends to make sure that people are not being disenfranchised. We may even have to work harder if the Supreme Court invalidates Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act protects voters by requiring that states with a documented history of discriminatory voting practices and low voter turnout submit planned changes of their election laws or procedures to federal officials or judges for prior approval. Those states and areas that are covered by Section 5 were selected the old-fashioned way. They earned it. The whole state of Virginia is a covered jurisdiction. The Supreme Court in Shelby County v. Holder, a county in Alabama, is challenging Section 5. With this decision, the Supreme Court could effectively invalidate Section 5, and this would essentially allow states and localities who have a recorded history of discrimination to implement any voter scheme or plan, even if it is known to have a discriminatory effect, and it would be up to the victims of the discrimination to raise the money to go to court to get it set aside. This would be devastating and would encourage localities who already have been selected because of their documented history of discrimination. It would encourage them to come up with sequential schemes and ideas that could undermine people's right to vote. But we're here to hear any specifics that you or any of your family members had during this, any problems you had during this election cycle, whether it was a rejection of your voter registration form that should have been approved or whether you had to stand in line for hours. Would like to hear it. Hearing your stories can help us do a better job to address the needs of the constituents in the 3rd District as we consider legislation to help future elections run more smoothly. Members of Congress are greatly concerned with the issue and have already begun to introduce legislation to address the problem. For example, Northern Virginia Congressman Jerry Connolly has introduced the Fair, Accurate, Secure, and Timely, FAST or FAST, Voting Act of 2012, which would let states compete for federal grants to develop reforms that would ensure elections run more smoothly and to reduce lines at polls. I have joined as a co-sponsor of this, and Senator Mark Warner has helped by introducing a companion bill in the Senate. In addition, Representative George Miller from California recently introduced the streamlined and improved methods at polling locations and early voting, or the SIMPLE Act. This bill will require that all states have early voting for at least 15 days prior to Election Day. There so far 88 members have signed on as co-sponsors. As you can see, we're concerned about the election process, but we need to hear problems you have faced so we'll know exactly what we need to do. So again, thank you for coming, and I'd like to start by reading a letter regarding an experience in Richmond from Tamara Copeland, who could not be here this evening. And she writes, I write on behalf of my two elderly aunts. Neither aunt married, nor do they have children. I am the child of their brother and their closest relative. They reside within the 3rd District in Richmond, Virginia. In October, my older aunt, aged 95, was hospitalized. Her younger sister, aged 91, asked that I help her complete the necessary forms to obtain absentee ballots so that both might vote in the upcoming presidential election. I did so, mailing the forms on Sunday, October 21st, to ensure sufficient time for receipt prior to the deadline. I checked box 7A for the reason for the inability to vote in person. The notation after the option read, requesting a ballot for presidential and vice presidential electors only. Ballot for other offices will not be sent. No supporting information indicated as necessary if this category was chosen. The week before the election, my aunts received notification that their request had been denied. Both aunts were very distraught by the news. When I contacted a friend who was working in the campaign, she learned for me that I should have marked box 2A, my disability or illness. Box 7A was reserved for people who would be out of the country and unable to vote. Nothing on the form provided that level of clarification. Because of this, my older aunt, who was hospitalized at the time of the election, was unable to vote. The younger one, who walks with a walker, did go to the polls to vote. She had to make special arrangements that she had hoped not to make, but recognized the importance of voting by whatever means it might take. I appreciate the efforts to ensure future absentee forms offer the clarification necessary for the application to make the correct choice. She notes that another complication could have been that the state Democratic Party had sent out many forms to people who had voted absentee in the past or might want to vote absentee, and there was a delay in time for the state party sending in those forms, and that might have been one of the reasons that she got her information, her denial that late. They could have, if they had gotten it early, of course, reapplied and gotten and filled out the form properly and gotten an absentee ballot. But I know many of you have had similar issues, and so we will now hear from anyone that has had a problem. If you would come to the mic and just let us know what problems you had. If you'd keep your remarks as brief as possible, but we want to make sure that everybody that wants to be heard can be heard. Who wants to be first?
I'll go first.
Yes, ma'am.
I have a copy for you if you'd like it.
Okay, and if you could give your name and the district you live in.
My name is Carol Lapestein, and because of redistricting, I am no longer one of your constituents.
Whatever.
Whatever, right. Anyway, well, I called this morning, and the gentleman I spoke to said I should still come and talk to you. First of all, thank you for all the good you have done and all the good you continue to do. My main reason for being here is that I'm an election official, and I have been an election official in Norfolk for the last 5 national elections. There have been all sorts of speculation. There has been all sorts of speculation about why the lines were so long in Norfolk. I can only speak to the precinct that I worked in. And the long lines at my precinct this year were a result of not enough election officials being assigned to work the poll books. The problem was not the number of voting machines. Only on rare occasions throughout the day did anyone have to wait more than 3 or 4 minutes for an available booth. Most of the day, there was at least one voting booth available. Usually, there were several that were available. The holdup was in verifying eligibility to vote and issuing voter access cards. Also, there was speculation about there being a delay in the voting booths because of the 2 amendments. That had nothing to do with it at the precinct where I worked. Precinct I worked, there were 2 election officials assigned to work the poll books. When I arrived the morning of Election Day, I was told 2 precincts had been combined into one for this election. This was a big election. 2 poll book workers for 1 precinct would have been a stretch. I had been trained to use electronic poll books in previous years, but when I called a couple of weeks before the election to ask about training, I was told I would not be needed to work the poll books this time. They figured 2 poll book workers would be enough. It wasn't. Fortunately, someone sent 3 poll books to our precinct, so there were 3 poll books set up. Early on Election Day, I told my precinct chief, who was a very capable man, that I could fill in at that 3rd poll book. After seeing how long the line was, he asked me to go ahead and do so. But that wasn't until 6:30, 6:45 in the morning. So we had already accumulated quite a few people in line. We never caught up. We never saw the end of that line until 6:45 that night, 15 minutes before the polls closed. Until that time, there was a constant line of voters waiting to be verified and issued a voter access card. Some people waited a couple of hours. In my opinion, this is voter suppression. Intended or not, that's the result. People who work an hourly wage simply cannot wait that long to cast a vote. They have to get back to work. Now, I'm not accusing anyone at the Office of Elections of trying to limit voter access. I understand they have limited resources and have to work with what they have. Nevertheless, I still see this as voter suppression. I think it is a case of poor planning. Although the Norfolk Office of Elections did not plan for enough poll book workers, they did plan well for the number of voting booths. They should take note for this for future elections. Then I have another issue with something that happened on Election Day. And this was about 6:45 at night. I was checking in a voter on the electronic poll book. And what you do with the poll book, you chiefly look it up. You start looking up the last name. And once a voter's registration is pulled up on the screen, there are 3 boxes that appear to the right of the voter's name. 1 box is an information box and is usually empty. Sometimes there is an I or an H in it that tells us some action we have to take in order to issue a voter card to the individual. The 2nd box fills in red with a black check mark when a voter access card is issued. The 3rd box is pink, and it indicates if a voter has cast an absentee ballot. While I was looking up a voter by last name, I came across another voter with a last name similar to the one I was looking up. I noticed that neither voter box had been checked on this other individual. I happen to know this other individual personally, and I know that this individual had cast an absentee ballot the previous week. The ballot was cast on Thursday, November 1, in the afternoon, at the Norfolk Voter Registrar's office. The vote was cast on an electronic voting machine. It was not on a paper ballot. I'd like to know what happened to the vote. I'm very concerned about how many other absentee ballots might have just been lost. It's very disturbing to me. I did bring it to the attention of my chief, but my chief did not know what to do with it, the information at that point.
Thank you. You mentioned lines at the polls. We did have some pictures of lines at the polls. if you can come in a little bit. It's kind of hard, I think it's kind of hard to see. And another picture of long lines at the polls. And a third picture of what looks to be like an auditorium full of people, which is in fact the line. It's in some schools, they allowed the line to come inside and wrap around, and I guess in this case, have a seat in the auditorium as they waited in line, which was the humane thing to do in light of the fact that it was frigid weather outside. Thank you for your testimony. And we'll have the next person, and as you're coming forward, I'd like to recognize the presence of our Commonwealth's Attorney, Greg Underwood, who's with us today, Norfolk's Commonwealth's Attorney, and member of City Council, Angela Williams, who's with us today. And School Board Chair Kirk Houston. I haven't... oh, there he is. Good to see you, Reverend Houston.
Good evening. My name is Vicki Williams Collins, and I reside in your district. And I had the distinct pleasure and the opportunity to work with the NAACP on their Protect the Vote campaign. And the NAACP and the Divine Nine and other groups collaborated to hold voter registration drives, voter information forms, and voter mobilization efforts, and we also provided voter protection training. What I'm going to do is try to make this as brief as possible, but there were some categories that I wanted to make certain that I mentioned to you. In regards to the registration process, we observed that there were problems with the applicant's if there were problems with the applicant's voter registration form, and the form was received by the deadline, the applicant was rarely notified in a timely manner or presented with the opportunity to correct the error. Additionally, if the applicant appealed the registrar's denial, and if the applicant won the appeal, the applicant was usually not given an opportunity to re-register, and they are often told that this was because they were awarded the appeal after the deadline for registration had passed. Absentee voting. Due to the massive national outreach of encouraging voters to vote early, many voters went to the registrar's offices and requested to vote early. Many of these same voters were often turned away with no explanation other than being told that Virginia did not have early voting. Registrars or their employees seemingly did not explain to these voters that Virginia did not have early voting and that she only allows absentee voting if you meet one of the excuses to vote absentee. This is also a passion of mine because for 6 years I served as the absentee voting coordinator for the Commonwealth of Virginia. So I'm quite well versed on the laws as it applies to that particular genre of voting. Election day, lack of election officials.
Are you suggesting that false information was given, inaccurate information was given?
I'm suggesting that inaccurate information was given. I'm not saying that it was false, but it wasn't, the whole picture was not given to them. Because of, as you had mentioned earlier, Congressman, you had spoke about early voting, and as you well know, Virginia doesn't have it. And so people would go into the registrar's offices and ask to early vote, and they were not given the entire picture.
Because you can only vote early if you have, if for some reason you can't get to the polls on election day and fit one of the excuses.
Absolutely.
Vacation, business, or disability, or some other thing. And if you don't meet one of those categories, there's no provision for early voting.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Election day, as the lady before me had spoke, lack of election officials. It seemingly there was an insufficient number of election officials working the precincts. The use of election procedures as it applied to special populations, and by that I meant senior citizens and disabled persons, was not consistently and fairly applied. It was observed by election protection observers, specifically in the Youngs Park precinct. Notice how senior citizens and disabled persons were given their paper ballots in a manner that did not allow for privacy. Additionally, after the election protection observers advocated for this population to be brought inside, because as you will well know, it was cold out there. They were permitted to enter the building. Their choice to use the paper ballot was taken away, and they were told they had to use the election machines, even if they didn't want to do so. And voters reported to the precincts, voters who reported to vote in the precincts and were told that they had already voted absentee. I had heard that myself. I had someone call me from Roanoke. They reported, they went to vote, and they were told they had already voted absentee. These voters had not requested, nor had they voted absentee. They were turned away or told they could vote provisionally. It was also found that when voters contacted their registrar's office, they were not on the books as voting absentee or as requesting an absentee ballot.
Say that last part again.
They were not on the books as voting absentee or as requesting an absentee
But they were told when they tried to vote that they were?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Voters were not consistently offered the option to vote provisionally. If they did not appear on the poll books, they were told they could not vote. And I observed that myself. They were not given that option.
And this is in the city of Norfolk?
This was in the city of Newport News.
Newport News, okay.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Anybody else?
Wasn't planning on speaking, but I want to use that as a segue
Okay.
what the last lady said, and thanks for doing this. My name is Jess Grimes. I'm in your district, 3rd District, and vote at the Taylor precinct, but I'm here because I volunteered for the Obama campaign and got roped into or put in a job where I was head of the ride to the polls for that particular day, which entailed some pre-planning, but a lot of crazy stuff happening during the day. So I was at the headquarters at 20th and Granby all day and kind of saw a lot of things going on. Before I go on with that, I want to interject one thing, and that is my wife was at voting at Taylor, and 3 times she had to push the button to get the Kane vote down. It would come up Allen every time, and when she finally called a observer over, they finally went for Kane. But anyway, back to what was happening. A lot of elderly, mostly the people that were being picked up were elderly, lived all over the city. And towards the end of the day, what we knew was that Young's Park was overloaded. I don't even know if their votes are officially counted as of a couple weeks ago. I don't think they were. It still shows 99% for Virginia. And I didn't see any of this. I would hear it. People would call in and say they're having trouble, especially at Monroe School. And again, the long lines. But the thing that the woman before me just said that reminded me of something. There was a woman who said, and she was in her 80s, that she had been told she had done an absentee vote. And there was nobody else to help, so I just said, okay, let me hear what she has to say. And she got on the phone and she said, what does absentee mean? And so, you know, that was that was kind of a dead giveaway. But I would say it would be important if we could get at least 15 days beforehand to have early voting. It's really an issue in a city like Norfolk, where you have polling places like Young's Park that aren't even, the vote's not even complete, the lines are so long. And the place where I was able to vote at Taylor School, where at 11 o'clock, first I was not able to do absentee vote because I didn't have the proper excuse, being a volunteer, even though it'd be tied up. Couldn't have it, so called over there.
I think working on election day, we need to check on that, because I think
I did check. I came down here and they said
work
no.
more than 14 hours.
14 hours.
Yeah, but if you're working somewhere in the campaign and can't get to the polls,
You have to be working more than 14 hours.
is that right? Well, we'll check on that, because I think if you can't get to the polls because you're working, even if it's on a campaign, we'll have to check on that. So you'll know. Next campaign will be very clear on that.
Well, I did find out. I bolted over to Taylor about 11 o'clock, had to stay in line only 15 minutes, And so maybe other people can do the math with that versus Youngs Park, Monroe, and other places. The people that we were taking people to the polls to vote were typically places that had extremely long lines. So,
Okay.
thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments?
My name is Vivian Page, and unfortunately I don't live in the 3rd either, but I live here in Norfolk, and I wanted to make sure that, Congressman, that you heard as well that perhaps it's time for us to have a set of federal voting laws instead of laws on a state-by-state basis. What we're seeing is all the differences between the localities being the way that things are being implemented, as well as what's happening from a state-to-state difference. I appreciate the fact that they're looking at implementing early voting across the country, but if we have to get it through the state legislatures, it'll never happen. So it's time for the United States to join other democracies across the world and have a national set of rules. Thank you.
Thank you. Most voting procedures are left up to the states, but there is one of the bills that I mentioned would specifically require early voting for at least 15 days. Shirley. In the meanwhile, I want to recognize the presence of the Secretary of the Norfolk Electoral Board, W. Donald Brown. It's in the back. Thank you, and thank you for coming.
I wasn't going to say anything, but I did have an opportunity to observe certain voting precincts, and of course, I voted in Norfolk for the first time this year. I think in probably 15 years or more. And my concern is that there were long lines, and it was cold, and there were a lot of elderly people and handicapped people who stood outside in the cold. And maybe that's something that we should look at in the future because that was not good. And but at the precinct that I went to, as soon as the people who were elderly, handicapped, or whatever got inside, they swiftly worked with them, but they still had to stand outside. There is a grant that's available every year. It's called HAVA, Help America Vote Act, and I would encourage the local electoral boards to look at writing the grant to get funding so that they can do the research. And of course, that's something that I'm doing with the nonprofits that I work with, because we know that people shouldn't have to stand out line according to that law. I mean, according to that act, the people are supposed to be able to go inside. And of course, it was impossible. But once they got inside, I saw that those in the precinct make sure that they were able to either sit down or they tried to make them comfortable after having been outside. And it's something that I would like to see us do in this area. I thank you very much for bringing us together at this meeting, because Phil Blanchard, who has a nonprofit, and I talked about the concern because he's handicapped. And it was not good. And I think that if we can come together as an area and have a meeting after this meeting and look at the Help America Vote Act as a community and as a district, that it can make a tremendous difference and help you when you go back to Congress. I think we should do that almost immediately.
Let me know.
And I would be glad to coordinate that so that we can get it done. How many of you would come to a meeting? And it's grant money, so it means that it's going to be money. We don't have to spend our own personal money. There's money there. We can monitor the election afterwards, and there can be people who would be paid to carry this out. So I'm going to count on you, and we'll pass the list around so that we can sign up and make this happen. Thank you, Congressman Scott.
Thank you.
Oh, and one other thing, I called the news media. There was so much money that was spent by candidates, not in little papers like my paper, not in the little political points. Billions of dollars were spent on the TV stations. And I called Channel 10, the only one that I could remember the number, and I said, where are you? And I was told that someone would be here. And I'm very disappointed that the media is not here, because this is very important. And hopefully they'll follow up with you.
Okay.
Good evening, Congressman Scott. I'm Greg Underwood. I'm Norfolk Commonwealth attorney. I'm speaking in my capacity as a private citizen to share with you my experience when I went to vote. I took off for lunch, and I voted in Chesterfield. There was a line that was took me 45 minutes to get in the door. Once I got in the door, it took me another 20 minutes to vote. So it took me well over an hour to vote. what I did notice was that for senior citizens, they made an exception, and for handicapped citizens, they made an exception. They would allow them to go to the head of the line, and I could appreciate that. And whether good or bad, I was mistaken for a senior citizen, so they offered they offered to let me in. I said, no, I want to stand out here with everybody else, just like everybody else. The other thing that concerned me was employers who have employees that work here in Norfolk that may live in another city like Virginia Beach or Chesapeake. They have to travel to that location to vote. If they don't vote in the morning before they come to work, then they have to vote when they get off of work. Seems like there should be a provision to allow people to vote during their lunch hour or some kind of extended lunch hour so that they can vote and not be rushed, because after getting off at 5 and the polls close at 7, you have to travel to Chesapeake or Virginia Beach, and then you're standing in a long line. It would appear to me to be to discourage voting. Again, thank you for having this community forum, and we appreciate all that you do, sir.
Well, thank you. One of the concerns, one of the reasons for early voting is that you don't get caught in a situation where you may not be able to get back if you haven't voted, at 6 o'clock in the morning, that you may not be able to get back before 7, or you get stuck in traffic. I mean, anything could happen, and that's why a lot of people like to vote early before Election Day and get it over with. So I appreciate your comments.
Thank you, sir.
Yes, ma'am.
Good evening, Congressman Scott.
Good evening.
My name is Jorna Taylor, and I'm the Executive Director of the Virginia Civic Engagement Table. What that is a coalition of about 30 organizations working locally and statewide throughout the Commonwealth, all who are committed to increasing voter participation and civic participation in general, particularly with historically underrepresented communities. I had the privilege of working here in Tidewater on our election protection program. Even though I live in Richmond, I was glad to be here. And I want to thank you for being out at the polls on Election Day. I also wrangled my boyfriend into helping us that day, and I got a text saying, "It's really cool, Congressman Scott's here telling people to stay in line." He was very excited about that, so thank you. For me, I love seeing democracy in action, and I really like seeing people that will stand in line for 5 hours. But you and I know that something's broken when that's happening. So I actually want to suggest a few solutions. And whether they're state or federal issues, it doesn't matter, because you have a bully pulpit and people will listen to you when you say things. So, number one, early voting. We need to remove the provisions of excuses to vote absentee in Virginia. On top of that, we need to increase the times and locations that folks are able to participate in early voting, including evening hours after 5 p.m. and on weekends. We also need to improve the administration of our elections. As some other folks referenced this evening, there weren't enough poll books at so many locations that we heard about on Election Day. Folks were in line because they couldn't be checked in fast enough. We need to improve how we're doing curbside voting. That takes a machine out of commission when they take the face off and run it out to the curb, have somebody vote, and then bring it back in. We had a lot of problems with curbside voting on election.
Okay, wait a minute on that one. Is that how you do curbside voting?
No, we have a paper ballot.
It's all different, yeah.
Okay, at our precinct, we had a paper ballot, and we verify that they're a registered voter, and then it's usually the chief or another election official who takes the paper ballot out to the car. It gets the voter votes and puts the ballot in an envelope, seals it, and hands it back to us. And then after 7 o'clock, when we're finishing everything up, someone is responsible for actually counting those votes.
In other locations, that was true in some, and in other locations, they take the face off of the electronic machine and run it out to the car and then bring it back in. So we've got to figure out a better system no matter what on curbside voting. We need to figure out, based on voting trends and population assessment, how we're allocating our resources. And we want to work with local registrars to help them get the resources that they so desperately need. We also want to help folks recruit.
On that, we understand that some projections of voter turnout used elections other than presidential elections. And when you allocate based on a gubernatorial election, you don't get the right numbers.
Right.
And so we need to make, you're absolutely right, those trends need to be better. Because in some areas, you know, the swing, some precincts everybody votes every time, and others vote sometimes not. In presidential elections, it's different. And we understand that some resources were allocated based on the gubernatorial election where most of the people didn't bother to vote.
Right.
And surprise, people voted.
And just a few more points on this. So we really want to work with local registrars to recruit these poll workers that are so desperately needed. Rely on community organizations like us to help you recruit folks and to help you train them. I've been a poll worker in a previous state, and the training I got was not enough on all of the nuances of election law. So, you know, let's work together to get everybody educated. On the issue of voter registration, we are technologically savvy enough, we are smart enough, we have motor voter. Why can't we be interfacing with other state agencies that people come into contact with every day to have a form of universal or automatic voter registration? That will solve a lot of our problems that we're seeing with voter registration. So, with that, thank you so much for your time this evening. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Congressman Scott, and people here. The previous two speakers I work with in a coalition, and wanted to make a couple of points of clarification. In terms of the early voting, and we keep talking about early voting, when you go into a registrar's office and we sent people in, and I purposely told them, don't say early vote. Tell them you want to vote absentee. If you tell a registrar that I want to vote early vote, they're going to tell you, no, we don't have early voting, and they actually turn people away. So you have to specifically say, I want to vote absentee, and that's what I think Ms. Vicki, who was just here earlier, that's what she was trying to say to you. You can't tell the people to say early vote to a registrar in Virginia because they're going to turn them around and tell them, no, we don't have that. So the terminology there was the issue with. I was personally at Young's Park, and when you talk about the situation in terms of persons having to do the curbside voting, which we educate and we train people throughout the state that they could actually, if necessary, ask the registrar to come out, ask the election official to come out if you can't go in so that you can actually vote curbside. At a site such as Young's Park, it just wasn't possible. They had approximately 10 or 12 elderly and handicapped people lined up. They were bringing a clipboard out with the ballot on, so there was no privacy in terms of the ballot. And when I finally pushed the election officials to allow the people to come inside, once they allowed the people to come inside, they then told them that they would not have the option to use the paper ballot. They would have to vote the touch screen, and which meant they would have to actually get in line to use the touch screen. And at that point, I said, this has to be crazy. I've never seen anything like this. So those were a couple of the concerns that I have in terms of what's being done. In addition to this, several calls have been made to the Norfolk registrar regarding meeting prior to election day to make sure that perhaps some of these problems could be discussed. And Joanna didn't mention it, but is it okay if I said she actually refused to meet with many of the civil rights groups, the election protection groups, just to discuss any potential for problems coming forth. She actually refused it. One other thing in terms of the person voting and who was told that she had already voted absentee, in Newport News at the Reed precinct, the person who experienced it actually called me personally doing that, and I told her, no, don't vote provisional. Let's follow this through to see what's going on. You go over town to the registrar's office and see what they're going to tell you. And she did. She went to the registrar's office. They pulled her name up, said, we don't have any. She was told, your name is okay. We don't have anything where you were voted. She went back to the polling place. They pulled her name up, and sure enough, that whole thing had gone. But this, I mean, she was able to vote. And but as Vicki mentioned, that wasn't the only incident as it related to persons being told. I think I had an incident in Norfolk that I was actually contacted on, that a person was told that they had already voted absentee, and it had not happened. So
now, are the voter books online or paper? On paper? At the polling place.
Norfolk. The poll books are the electronic poll books.
Okay, so it ought to be, you ought to have the same thing
That they have.
connected. You ought to have the same thing on the screen that you got in the registrar's office. So what must have happened, they must have been looking at the wrong name.
I know she stayed there. I told her to check, get the election official's name, and then go over to the registrar's office and ask them to pull your name up. And when she did that, her name came up okay. She went back to the Reed precinct. She voted with no problem.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Long time. Good morning. Good afternoon.
Good evening.
I'm here today because there was a situation.
Do you want to give your name?
My name is Larry Blanchard. Oh,
Okay.
God, I thought you remember me as well.
Okay.
Anyway, my name is Larry Blanchard to everyone, and I'm here today in regards to a voting matter that I incurred in 1987. There was a law passed in '94 that says that there was a fifth offender status, and my incidents had occurred in '87. 1994, when the habitual offender status law was passed, I was involved in it. They took my license, and my purpose to vote then was revoked because of a felon. I had to wait 10 years to reapply for that status and my driver's license. And what I did, that was 2004. And it is now 2012, and I still don't have the privilege to vote. I've had my brother, Dr. Michael Blanchard. He's been working with me in order to help me obtain my voting right, along with a few more veterans we have. He's the president of the chapter for veterans. I myself, I'm a disabled Vietnam veteran, but I still haven't the privilege to vote. There's quite a few veterans that he's working with. He was informing me that has the same problem that I've been incurring, the privilege to vote. There's 20, 30 of us who still haven't the privilege to vote because of the infractions that was incurred in the earlier days of our life that hasn't been removed. We don't know how to get them removed. I filled out the form that was necessary to seek reinstatement for my voting privilege.
When did you fill those out?
For every election there has been.
Did you try this year?
Yes, I did. Certainly did.
If you call our office, we'll be able to talk to you on your individual case. But in general, Governor McDonnell has been much more efficient in restoring rights than most of the other governors. I mean, it's gotten better each year over the years. And Governor McDonnell earlier this year said that any application that was in by this summer would be acted on. I mean, some of the governors, just sit there and, you might get an answer, you might not. He said anything by early summer, he will act on in time to vote. And the best I can determine, everybody who applied by early this summer was able to vote. If they got their rights restored, was able to vote. Some, for one reason or another, were not eligible to get their rights restored at that time. But if it's been a long time since the last infraction, there should not be a problem under this administration. So if you'll call our office, anybody on the front row over here can give you a business card, and we'll help you on that.
And this would be because each election,
well, we'll see what the problem is, because this year there should not have been a problem.
Yeah.
There may be something that's not apparent, and we'll let you know what it is. But just call our office. We'll work with you on it.
Okay.
Good.
Thank you.
But let me just say, for those who are unable, Virginia is one of the few states that you are unable to vote for the rest of your life if you've been convicted of a felony. The governor has the right to restore those rights, and the last few governors have been fairly liberal. If you haven't had an infraction for several years, in restoring your right to vote. It's not a pardon. It's not a, it doesn't, it's not a forgiveness, but you are able to vote and have other civil rights like run for public office and things like that. So let's see what the problem is. We need to take advantage of it. Now the problem, the real problem is that the governors that are restoring thousands of people's rights, 1,000, 3,000, 8,000, but there are hundreds of thousands of people who have felonies. So it's just really a drop in the bucket. But we want to take advantage of as many of those drops as we can. And so we'll help you in your case, and anybody you know, make sure they apply. They're fill in the blank forms that can be used. You can get them from the registrar's office or the secretary, Secretary of the Commonwealth's office in Richmond. Just fill in the blanks and fill in the forms. And if it's been several years since the last infraction, I don't know how to describe it, it's nothing really egregious that would cause the governor not to want to be involved in that particular case. It should be a fairly routine process. I think the governor has been restoring 80, 90% or more that apply, so it's not, so it's a fairly routine process, and we want to encourage everybody to vote and participate in elections.
Good evening.
Good evening.
My name is Michael Blanchard. I wanted to address an issue that I encountered. We work with a lot of veterans, and ours is more street. There are a lot of people, veterans, who are homeless, they're suffering. There's a lot of things they can't take advantage of because they don't know. One particular person that I was dealing with this weekend, been to Vietnam twice. Had issues and problems, all kind of sicknesses, hypertension, blood pressure, and he has had 3 strokes. Doesn't get any kind of compensation from the military. My address is to reach these guys that are in the street, the homeless, veterans. There are no provisions for veterans who are, he's not senile, he's sick, and there's no provisions to mobilize to get these guys registered, to get them to the polls, it's just, if you're homeless and you don't have anywhere to stay and you're sick, your knees hurt, they just don't vote. And
well, they can vote. There used to be a time where if you didn't have a permanent address, you couldn't register to vote. But the Supreme Court has ruled that having a place to live is not a prerequisite of registering to vote. You do the best you can in ascertaining where you usually are in terms of where to vote. Mm-hmm. But you can register to vote, notwithstanding the fact that you're homeless. If you have a person with veteran with disabilities, have them call our office and we'll help them make sure he gets through that process.
Okay, thank you.
My name is Kimberly Lyles, and I'm here to address the voting situation because I tried to bring a 6-year-old or 7-year-old autistic child with me because he was learning about the election and he was really into it, and I wanted to encourage that. But myself and my 4 children are under a domestic violence umbrella, so to speak, and there's what appears to be on public records is not actually what my address is, okay? So I went to the city of Chesapeake, which is where I currently reside, and did all my stuff there, and they said, no, you have to go to Pretlow to vote. So my husband and I both go. My husband votes. He has no problem. And in the interim, I'm getting nothing but grief. Now, I'm a victim. I didn't ask to live in a fishbowl, and I didn't ask to live with my mail going one place and getting redirected 4 different times. I didn't ask for that. I actually sought refuge in Norfolk to get out of that situation. So to have the very same city turn around and when I go to vote, the woman, number one, reads my information out loud publicly, like really, really loud. And she's like, well, why aren't these addresses? Why? There was one address and then there was another address. One address was you could like click on it and the other one you couldn't. Well, there was a reason why you couldn't click on the other one. So we tried to explain this to her quietly. Some guy got really nasty with me, and then they handed me an absentee ballot. So now I've already been victimized and lived in a fishbowl for 6 years. Okay, fine, I can deal with that. I also have trouble voting. Okay, I can deal with that. It's an important issue for a lot of us, even though we may not publicly do it. For everybody to know, it's still our own personal issue. We're trying to teach our children, which are our futures, a good example. Autistic or not, he'll still have the right to vote. I don't care if he votes for Barney Simpson, doesn't matter. He still has the right to vote if he's, a United States citizen. But then I get that the paper ballot I filled out, was kicked back by the city of Norfolk because my address wasn't correct. And I have a letter from the state which shows I am under a family protection umbrella and my children.
You voted a provisional ballot?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Now, no offense, but do you understand how much of a slap that is? Do you know how many victims there are out there?
Is the address on your voter registration form I guess you'd say a false address?
No. It's an address that, before I became a victim, is where I lived. We moved because I had to escape a situation, and so we went to an undisclosed address in Norfolk because my son has IEPs.
And where that undisclosed address is not the one that's on the registration form for privacy purposes?
For privacy purposes only. But I was registered to vote at my legal address, okay? They documented.
Give your name and address where we can get in touch with each other, lady in the front row, because we have the privacy given to domestic violence victims in terms of phone, telephone, caller ID, address, and a lot of the other things is disguised for a reason. We have to see how that's going to work with voter registration.
Right, but a lot of your voter registration people are not sensitive to it.
Well, let's see what.
And aren't trained in it.
Let's see what. Let's see. I don't know what the law is on this. So if you just give your name and address where we can get in touch with you,
Absolutely.
Or if you'd like to call us, however you want to work.
And I'll give them my information.
Give it to her, and then we'll try to find out exactly how that should work. And I don't know right now because
as high as domestic violence rates are, and the severity under which the umbrella I live, I shouldn't have to add insult to injury. Nobody else should either.
You clearly aren't the only one, but there ought to be some protocol for this, and let's see what it is.
You need to be trained on it.
Good. Anybody else? Yep.
Good evening, Congressman Scott. My name is Chris Teeter. I also faced a similar situation as the young lady that just spoke, as far as change of address on the voter registration form. And I had previously voted at the address that I lived at, but when it came time for me to receive my voter registration card or whatnot, I received a letter that I was ineligible to vote at that address. So that was the only problem that I heard.
Did you move?
I think I did move,
okay.
But
if you move, you're required. This gets a little technical. You're required to notify the registrar of your new address. I remember when I was in the House of Delegates, if you moved 2 weeks before an election, you didn't live at the address you're registered at, and it's too late to register at your new address. And at that time, there's no provision for you to vote at all. And we changed that to allow you to go back to your home address, your former home, so you could at least vote somewhere.
Right.
But make sure if you have moved, make sure whatever happened this time, make sure you get your address straight so that your driver's license and home and everything else are consistent. Because if you have a driver's license and your other ID is not the same as what's on the voter registration log, you could expect you could expect a problem.
Right, and my question then was, how do we become more privy of the actual dynamics of voting?
When you have to change your address, the the State Board of Elections is supposed to get that information out. From a practical point of view, the political campaigns try to get that information out, informing people that it's important to register to vote if you moved and all that. And as we distribute campaign literature, that kind of information is supposed to be disseminated. But the bottom line is you have to be registered where you expect to vote, and if you moved, you have to notify the state your driver's license and everything else. When you change your address at the DMV, they ought to explain. I don't know how proactive they are, but you would certainly have an opportunity to update your voter registration right there at DMV.
Right, and I think that that's what happened, and I actually think that I may have moved and it was in the same district. So I was wondering, you know, how the problem came about, even if it's in the same district. I still had a problem with it.
Well, was your ID that you presented have the same address as was on the voter registration record?
When it came time to vote, it did. I made sure that I had the right address for that.
Whatever, I don't know what happened last time, but just make sure all your stuff is consistent.
Okay.
So, I mean, we have elections every year, and in fact, you live in Norfolk?
Newport News.
Okay, and Norfolk has an election, next week, a couple of weeks? On the 18th. It's uncontested? No. They have an election for the House of Delegates coming up next week. 89th House of Delegates District, to fill the vacancy created when Ken Alexander was elected to the state senate. So anybody in Norfolk needs, if they have some getting straight to do, they got to get straight almost immediately.
Okay.
Good, thank you.
Thank you.
Are there other comments? If not, I want to thank everyone for coming. The information that we have received today not only will go to Congress, but to the local Board of Elections and to some election officials. Hopefully this is the last time. I think the President, in his victory speech on election night, pointed out that people had to stay in line for a long time and indicated that we'd try to do something about it. Because at some point, you're denying people the right to vote if you have to stay in line for 3 and 4 hours. Maybe 5 minutes is not unreasonable, maybe 15 minutes, an hour. When you get to 3 and 4 hours, some people just can't stay in line, just are unable to stay in line that long. Some people have to get back to work. But at some point, you're denying people the right to vote. We have a democracy, and you just can't do that. And so we're going to try to do something about it on the federal level. I know there's some bills already pre-filed in the General Assembly coming up this session to provide for early voting. I think Janet Howell from Northern Virginia has introduced a bill to do that. She's introduced several times. And perhaps the problems we've had on Election Day will make the passage of that a little more likely. But we're going to consider things on the federal level, too. So thank you, and the meeting is now adjourned.